On this channel, we talk about what it means to be autistic in the world today. And as you'd expect, I get a lot of comments and messages from people who've recently learned that they're autistic or are in the process of discovery. You'll see such comments on most of my videos, especially those that talk about self-identification or the diagnostic journey. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic, and this is Autismatic. People introduce themselves in all sorts of ways, and I look forward to the new stories I'll learn every time I release a new video. Every story is different, but there are a few common themes that pop up frequently.
Hi Quinn. I was diagnosed last year. I'm in my 40s. People have said I could be autistic for years, but I didn't think it possible until my therapist said I should think about it, because I've never, ever had a meltdown.
In fact, when I mentioned that fact to a YouTuber friend of mine recently, they said this.
When Quinn told me he was going to do this video, it really resonated with me because I myself haven't really experienced meltdowns. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have, but not to the degree or to the severity that you read so much about within the autism literature or hear about in every other autism video.
Even though it's one that's easily corrected, it's an autism myth that lays the foundations of imposter feelings that can often persist for years, especially during those times when we're forced to ask for basic accommodations. That grumbling doubt that makes us feel like we're pushing our luck when we're just asking for simple human decency has its roots in such misunderstandings. 20-odd years ago, when I worked in healthcare, my workplace ran a compulsory training session about how to interact with our neurodivergent clients, most of whom were children back then, with parents attached, of course. They weren't calling it neurodivergence then. The course title was something about mental disabilities, but most of what they covered were what we would now recognise as neurodivergences: autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD and the like, along with mention of intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome and a couple of common mental illnesses. This was back when I didn't tell people that I'm autistic myself, but there was quite a bit of interest around autism in the session because a couple of colleagues had autistic nephews. Much of the training wasn't to my taste or particularly enlightening. But whilst I didn't learn anything about autism that day, it was still quite an education in human nature, I suppose. Because of the added interest, the instructor asked what we all knew about autism, then wrote up some bullet points from our answers and added a couple of their own. That became a list of what they called characteristics of autism, which I still think was a remarkably thoughtful choice of words for the time. After the instructor told us a couple of stories about some maths genius Asperger's kids, he crossed out dull and slow-witted from the list, which left us with rude, insensitive, cold, non-verbal, tics, which is what I think they were calling stims, and meltdowns. We were then asked to rate those characteristics by their severity. I seemed to be the only one who didn't understand what they meant by that, and I asked for clarification. Imagine you were autistic, they suggested. I know. Imagine you were autistic yourself. Which of these characteristics do you think would be the worst one? The one that would cause you the most bother and you'd like to change the most? That put me in the awkward spot of either pointing out that the list was woefully inadequate and pretty judgmental, thereby opening myself up to troublesome questions about how I knew, or just accepting his answer and keeping my head down. So, that was how I came to be sat in amongst a diverse group of about 30 fellow employees, some of whom were highly trained and qualified healthcare professionals, whilst they decided amongst themselves that autistic people must hate having meltdowns the most, because having one must be so embarrassing.
Matron, take them away!
So, assembled autists who are watching this now, any of you agree? Hands up, all of you who think that the embarrassment of meltdowns is the most troublesome aspect of being autistic.
Anyone? Anyone? Hello?
No, I didn't think so. When I've melted down, I can assure you that losing face in public doesn't appear anywhere on my list of concerns during or after the event. Meltdowns are a whirlwind experience from the inside, and few of us remember much about them afterwards. There's nothing about them that's planned or calculated, no conscious thought or consideration whatsoever. They are involuntary and spontaneous, unwelcome and highly unpleasant to experience. Amongst the requests for help that we advocates receive on a regular basis, meltdowns feature quite a lot. But those pleas come in two very distinct flavours. On the one hand are questions posed by mainly non-autistic parents, friends, partners and employers who are looking for advice on how best to handle someone when they melt down. I often get queries from paid carers and professionals, but usually along with a caveat to not let anyone else know they ask me. They might be after generic info they can adapt for themselves, or they may tell me a story about the individual they want to help in the hope of more strategic advice. The emphasis varies from a detached desire to prevent damage to property and reputation to heartfelt love and concern and a wish to minimise the suffering of someone they care about. When autistic people come to me for help, it's not about being handled. No query about meltdowns from an autistic respondent has asked me about dealing with them. They've asked about prevention. Somewhere in the title or the thumbnail of this video, there's a phrase along the lines of, "You've been getting meltdowns all wrong." And this is why I say that. When people who have no personal experience of any of the aspects of autistic meltdowns or their precursors come to me for assistance, their questions are almost always framed by one assumption that gets in the way of them actually helping at all. They ask me about what they should do when their autists have a meltdown. Should they restrain them or leave them to flail around and shout? Is there anything they can do to calm them down or protect them from harming themselves? And what should they do if everyone's drinking out of Granny's best china at the moment their autist falls to pieces? Their concerns are about minimising the consequences and any damage their autist may wreak upon property, on other people, or themselves. Autistic people don't ask me questions like that. For a start, many of them know, like I do, that during a meltdown there's very little we can do as individuals to alter the outcome, because we really don't have much conscious control of ourselves in those few brief seconds. They know that no matter how gently or kindly anyone suggests we chill out and think about things, no amount of exposing us to alternative perspectives is going to make any difference. When meltdown strikes, there's not much connection between our higher faculties and our bodies or mouths. It's fight and flight all smushed up together in a nasty, spitting, shouting ball of arms, legs and fists that just needs to get as far away from the here and now as quickly as possible. But that's not what makes the difference in the questions us advocates get asked, though. It's something more fundamental. Whilst outsiders ask me what to do when their autists have meltdowns, autistic people ask me how to prevent them, because they know the most important fact about autistic meltdowns that most of the non-autistic world seems to have missed. Meltdowns aren't inevitable. If I ever wondered why I don't have meltdowns was such a significant source of autistic imposter syndrome in late identified adults, there's your answer. Meltdowns have become so synonymous with autism, so intrinsically linked with the commonplace understanding of the autistic experience, that they've almost come to define many people's perception of what autism is. And that's ridiculous, because they're nowhere near as common as people think. I've not yet found any reliable statistics on the incidence or frequency of autistic meltdowns, but if my experience of talking to hundreds of autistic people over the last 40 years is any indication, about a quarter of us have never experienced anything that they could reliably identify as a meltdown or similar event. Now and again, that can be down to misunderstandings about what an autistic meltdown actually is.
Because I myself haven't really experienced meltdowns. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have, but not to the degree or to the severity that you read so much about.
A meltdown is not a tantrum, as even some well-known professionals have been known to dig their heels in on. Nor is it a panic attack or an enraged outburst. However, they can sometimes look like any or all of those things. To the outsider, a meltdown can look like sudden, unprovoked explosion of limbs, spittle and animal noises that could put anyone present at risk. Some of us punch, bite, scratch and spit. Plenty of us cry and wail, and some of us soil ourselves on occasion. Sometimes, a meltdown can look to onlookers like a premeditated outburst, calibrated for maximum hurt. So it's perhaps no wonder that they've garnered so much attention. They can be pretty spectacular and have long-lasting effects. From the inside, it's a different matter. I personally can usually remember every detail of the feelings and thoughts coursing through me during a meltdown, all my needs and intentions, but very little about what's going on around me. I know that I'm desperate for a way to fix or end or escape from whatever is tormenting me, and I'm in the thrall of my primal autopilot that has little regard for the niceties of polite society if they get in the way of survival. I'm only barely aware of what I'm saying or doing. I'm watching like a spectator, riding around in my own skull as this me puppet reacts unthinkingly to the pain being meted upon it. If you're interested in a more detailed account, I made a video about one of my own childhood meltdowns a few years ago, which I'll link up here. Because of misconceptions about what meltdowns feel like or look like, or even simply because people weren't as straight with us as we would have liked when we were kids, some of us learned that actually, yes, we did have meltdowns. We just didn't recognise them for what they were at the time. Most often they were written off as the proverbial tantrums, exam anxiety or new school anxiety, growing pains, teen angst, or even sidelined by more immediate concerns such as epilepsy, migraines, mental illness or eating disorders. But once we get past the misconceptions and we're all on the same page, my own estimate is that around a third of the diagnosed autists I've spoken to on the subject had meltdowns in childhood, and about half of them still had them after the age of 18. So, if my reckoning is right, and I do stress this is just from my observations alone, so there's room for some enterprising researchers to do some groundbreaking work here, guys. If my reckoning is right, and about a third of us have had meltdowns at some point in our lives, and a quarter have never had one at all, that leaves a big chunk unaccounted for. More than a third of us. And what about those folks who used to have meltdowns when we were kids, but don't now? Like me. We don't melt down. We shut down instead. A shutdown can be as distressing to onlookers as a meltdown, but only if they're paying attention. A shutdown autist can often be ignored because we're not presenting an immediate challenge, rarely making any noise or drawing attention at all. In fact, that's part of the point of us shutting down. Shutdowns vary as much as meltdowns do, but they all involve us withdrawing and becoming uncommunicative. Some of us will become almost completely unresponsive, even to being prodded or tickled. We might just about register our name, but otherwise be silent and immovable. Some of us, myself included, might hum or mumble. We might shake or twitch or rock, sometimes with movements that might look painful to you and may or may not align with our peaceful stims. My breathing often becomes erratic and gasping, so when I do try to speak, I'm barely intelligible, and this can go on for hours or on odd occasions, a couple of days. I'm conscious and aware throughout. Still listening, still remembering. But I'm disconnected from myself in a way I've never been able to fully describe. It's not dissociation, not catatonia, not sleepwalking or a seizure of any sort, but it's not being fully connected to myself either. I can't initiate action, only observe until everything passes. When we melt down, we're trying to eliminate the stressors, but when we shut down, we're hiding from them. Apart from that 25% or so that don't relate to the meltdown experience at all, everyone else has had shutdowns, either instead of meltdowns altogether, alongside them, or since they stopped melting down sometime in childhood. I fall into that latter category myself. Although I've been saying meltdown over and over again in this video, and now shutdowns too, both of those are words I actually kind of dislike. Meltdown, in particular, has been misused so often it's lost any real sense of what it was meant to convey in an autistic context. And, as we've already discussed, even that has a history of being a bit fuzzy in people's minds. It also doesn't adequately describe what meltdowns and shutdowns are either. They are stress events. Both meltdowns and shutdowns are involuntary reactions to overwhelming stress and strain on our cognitive faculties. I'll get to the hows and whys in just a moment, but for now, it's just important that we see what these distressing episodes are without any of the understandable fears or concerns that are front and centre whilst a stress event is unfolding. When someone melts down or shuts down, it's because we've been subjected to stress and stimulation beyond our ability to cope. We're overloaded, filled to bursting, pushed beyond our limits. For just a moment, our conscious minds take a back seat to allow some ancient, primal part of ourselves to take the wheel. And it's that part of us which chooses to either fight back against the pain in a meltdown or escape from it by shutting down, turning inside ourselves and insulating ourselves from it. It's little different to the fight or flight response we all learn about in Nature 101. When we melt down, we externalise our stress reaction. We attempt to fight back against the monsters to ease the pain. When we shut down, we close off from the world and try to muster our strength, whilst, hopefully, the stress monsters will ease up or even go off to torment someone else in the meantime. No true autistic meltdown or shutdown has ever had an agenda or a hidden message. None of them was subject to any conscious thought at all, let alone planning, and their message is plain and clear for all to see. Stop. That's it. Stop. Whatever you're doing that's causing the pain, or if it's not you, do something to help stop whoever or whatever is responsible. What should you be stopping, you might ask? How can you stop doing something if we don't tell you what it is? Well, there's no point asking us when we're melting down or shutting down, is there? We're in the middle of a barely coherent stress event, so we're no use to anyone. So use your noggin. Good old Occam's razor would suggest that the most likely candidate for thing you ought to stop doing is whatever you were doing immediately before you noticed us change. And that's not a bad place to start. But before we even think about specifics, you'll need to know a little bit about what's going on inside us when a stress event is brewing. I'm going to make a statement now that should not be controversial, but these days I'm not sure that someone won't kick off. But here we go. We all want to be happy, don't we? I mean, we don't all agree on the necessary ingredients for what makes us happy for sure. Some of us even think they have the right to tell other people what should make them happy. But whatever floats our individual boats, most of us want the end result to be something I think we could call contentment. A Goldilocks zone wherein we feel safe, appreciated and sufficiently positively stimulated to keep us engaged whilst not overloading us with negatives and challenges. When things don't go our way, our mood goes south. We feel cold, unpleasant emotions that we prefer to avoid. Sadness, grief, anger, resentment and so on. When things go well for us, we feel warmer, desirable emotions. Excitement, glee, jubilation. But in between those two extremes lies the contentment zone, where the emotional porridge is just the right temperature to be neither exhaustingly over-positive nor soul-drainingly negative. Cheer up, lad. It might never happen. My dad used to say that to me all the time when I was usually just deep in thought. That's my autistic resting miserable face for you. But it illustrates that need we all feel for balance. We all do it. We seek out people whose mood or temperament matches our own, and if they deviate, we seek to restore balance whenever we suggest they cheer up or chill out. Something as innocuous as my dad's affectionate criticism there could even trigger a stress event itself, but how would he know that a comment he'd made dozens of times before would be the catalyst for a meltdown that day? And even if he made the connection, would the answer really be as simple as him never making that comment again? Autistic stress events may well be triggered by a single thing that you'd be well advised to stop doing as soon as you recognise what's happening. But that trigger is unlikely to be the root of the problem, nor even very high on the list of things to eliminate. It's just the most obvious. You see, stress events, whether they be explosive meltdowns or shrinking shutdowns, aren't an inevitable aspect of the autistic experience. For most of us, they are pretty much avoidable, if you know how, and not even all of us autists know how best to do that because it's so rare for anyone to actually try to help us work out why we melt down or shut down, rather than just police us when our defences do break down. I made a video a while back about how most autistic people I've met express empathy and interest in other people by socially mirroring, recounting similar tales to theirs to demonstrate understanding and commonality. I pointed out that many of us, including myself, aren't naturally very good at performative sympathy, the there, never mind kind of thing that a lot of people do find comforting at difficult times. The last few weeks, in fact, have been a stark reminder of how inadequate I am at doing that kind of thing, but I'll talk about that at another time. That instinct, that urge to say there to an unhappy friend comes from the same place as my dad telling me to cheer up. It's the desire to reach and maintain emotional equilibrium, the Goldilocks zone of feeling where we're neither unhappy nor overexcited and just feeling okay. And we want everyone else to be in the same zone too, because that helps us maintain our own moods. It's easy to think of emotions in terms of temperature. We associate happy, upbeat and positive feelings with warmth, comfort and energy, whilst sadness, grief and discontent are cold, dreary and wearisome. If someone is feeling low, we try to cheer them up. Tell them a funny story, pay them a compliment, or talk about their favourite things to lift their spirits and raise the emotional temperature. Similarly, if they were getting overexcited or unreasonable, you might convey some sobering home truth to drop the emotional heat to an acceptable level, to chill out. We spend our waking lives afloat in a bath of emotional and sensory feedback generated by the people and environment around us. Some of us, especially a lot of autistic people, are very sensitive to the feelings of others, and we pick up on them all too readily. In fact, it's quite unwelcome a lot of the time. When that emotional and sensory bath gets a bit too cold, we can turn on the metaphorical hot tap. Do something positive or pleasant that'll cheer us up. We treat ourselves.
What do we treat ourselves to?
Clothes.
Treat yourself.
Fragrances.
Treat yourself.
Massages.
Treat yourself.
Mimosas.
Treat yourself.
Fine leather goods.
Treat yourself.
If we put too much hot emotion and experience in so we get too excited or irresponsible, we can turn the cold tap on to sober up our worldview with something more serious and grounded. All day long, day after day, month after month, we keep topping up our emotional bars with a bit of positivity here to warm us up, a little sobering thought when we need to come down, and on throughout our lives. But if life really was a bath, we'd not be able to keep topping it up to maintain that cosy temperature forever. The bath is only so deep. What do we do when it gets close to full? Well, we pull the plug out and drain some off, don't we? But what if, when we pulled the plug out, we couldn't then turn the tap off? And whilst we were wrestling with it, someone stuck a couple of hose pipes in the bath behind our backs too? What if the rate of water pouring in was way faster than it could drain away, and we couldn't even tell where it was coming from? You'd find yourself fighting a losing battle to keep that bath from spilling out and flooding the bathroom. And that's precisely how I describe the predicament of an autist on the threshold of meltdown or shutdown. It's called the autistic flood. Just before we collapse into a stress event, there's a moment when we feel that first trickle as the immense burden of feeling and tension seeps over the edge, heralding the flood that will follow. It's a helpless moment of both panic and relief before we relinquish conscious control. You see, it's not just happy, sad feelings filling up that bath for us. It's a lot more. Being autistic isn't just about emotions or communication. It's felt not only in our hearts, but in our fingertips, in our ears and our thoughts. The key differences that make us autistic lie in three areas, which we call the autistic triad of distinction. Three fundamental ways in which autistic people process the world differently to everyone else. Every misunderstanding or difficulty we have communicating or getting along with someone else stems from one or more of these three differences with the majority. We sense things differently, we process emotions differently, and we are, on the whole, inextricably tied to a need for informational fidelity and candour. Veracity. When we experience a stress event, it's not because of something someone has said or did there and then, though it will have played its part by lighting the blue touch paper, so to speak. Stress events are simply the final expression of the flood of pain and confusion that's been accumulating for hours, days, or even months beforehand, and not just emotional pain. When we talk about autistic masking, we so often think about it in terms of active social camouflage, of altering our bearing and our manner to better be accepted by the mainstream. But we don't as often talk about the masking of pain, of hiding our sensory torment, of biting our lips as lie after lie is accepted over our protests. The true nature of the autistic mask is a little uglier. Not a tool to help us succeed, but a vital defence against ostracisation and starvation. That mask is what allows us to bathe in the waters of life in the first place, because without it, few of us would be accepted or even survive in this increasingly transactional world. But it's tremendously draining, and is very high on most autistic people's real lists of traits they'd rather do without. It's not that, as autistic people, we're less tolerant of stimulus. We don't sit in shallower metaphorical baths that fill up too quickly, nor do we lack a plug hole to drain the overstimulation when it fills up. We're just as capable of letting off steam as anyone else for the most part. But we are more or less helpless to stem the flow when the taps get turned on full, especially when there are so many of them turned on at once. Every emotional disconnect, every sensory discomfort, and each and every confusion over what someone might really mean adds to the flood until it gets too much. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, happy or sad stimulus, or how it balances against the rest of our days. It's just stimulus. And all those stimuli add up. Every spark that travels down a nerve is a trickle that adds to the flood. It's no coincidence stress events often occur at emotionally charged times or when there's a lot going on to take in. Because at that time, a particular stimulus is overloading us, but it's not acting alone. It's simply adding to an already close to overflowing burden of disconnection and pain for which you may bear no responsibility, or even know it exists. Unseen, behind the masks we have to wear, is a boiling mess of not only emotional disconnection, but the confusion of mismatched senses, the alienation of not being in on the assumptions that regulate other people's lives, confusion at the contradiction all around us, and sometimes all it takes is something trivial, something minor to tip us over the edge, to open the floodgates, to pull the trigger, pop the balloon, or whatever analogy floats your boat. Once a stress event starts, there's little to nothing you or anyone can do to mitigate it or ease it for us. You can only take a step back, make sure everything is safe, and try to remove as much stimulation as possible. Turn off noisy things, dim the lights, or draw the blinds. Stop people talking and give them space. That's all you can do. Then you just wait for the overstimulation to subside, and they eventually come back to you. So, given that they're next to impossible to mitigate and they're horrible experiences for everyone concerned, why do we still let meltdowns happen in the first place? It may well be true that a quarter of diagnosed autists have never experienced a meltdown or a shutdown, but they all know what I mean when I talk about the autistic flood. Whilst some of us have been lucky or resourceful enough to have never quite tipped over the edge into full meltdown or shutdown, I've never yet met an autist I could communicate with who didn't relate to the flood. We all know what it feels like, even if we haven't been unlucky enough to fall over the edge into a recognisable stress event. But don't be fooled into thinking it's just a matter of learning to recognise the feeling that we're flooding and stepping away from it just in time, because that's often a lot easier said than done. Sometimes it's possible, but frankly, if we're that close to the edge already, there's not a lot of resolve left to do anything with. We're usually past the point of no return. The key lies in both us as autistic folks and the people who care about us learning to recognise the discontinuities in life that exert the greatest strain on our well-being and minimising them where we can. You don't deal with meltdowns, you deal with the causes of meltdowns. You deal with the flood. And it's not a by-the-numbers process. It varies from person to person, from autist to autist, depending on our personal combination of triad factors and the spikes in our individual skill sets. There aren't any really useful tips and tricks for managing stress events that don't start with prevention, and what form those precautions take will be as unique as the individual themselves. General principles may apply, but they're not enough on their own to manage the autistic flood for most of us. That takes understanding ourselves and having people around us who are willing to accommodate some very simple differences in most cases. How we manage our local water levels to keep them from flooding is going to depend on which autistic traits are present in us, how they manifest, and how disconnected those traits are with the local perception of normal. The greater the disconnect with local people or with our environment, then the greater the flow and the more chance our bath of well-being will overflow and flood into a stress event. My bath doesn't flood very often these days, despite having been through some very difficult times lately. I've struggled and suffered in other ways, but I haven't had a meltdown or a shutdown for several years now. It's not enough to know that stress events are a result of overload. You need to know what is overloading and why it causes you stress, and that's where the autistic triad of distinction can help us understand all of ourselves better. This isn't to be confused with the old outdated triad of impairment shtick. This is something which is autistic-led, not something imposed on us by non-autistic theorists. The autistic triad of distinction is a tool for understanding the stresses that define us as autistic. Every autistic stress event is triggered by an overstimulation in one or more of these areas of concern, and understanding how that happens and why can make a huge difference not only to whether or not we have stress events, but how we lead our lives overall. This is the first time I've mentioned the Autistic Triad in a while, but you'll be hearing a lot more about it in the coming months, so make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell for more on the topic. And think about supporting me on Patreon so I can pay the rent while I write it all. Meltdowns are neither an essential part of the autistic experience, nor are they an inevitability, but the autistic flood is. Using the Triad to identify my stressors and manage them more efficiently has made my life a lot easier. Maybe it'll help you too. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching. Okay, it's a postscript. It's a quick word for regular viewers. At the end of last year, we lost someone very close to us, which left a huge hole in our lives, both emotionally and practically. So I had to take a little bit of time off to make the necessary arrangements, to grieve, and to adjust to the huge changes in our lives and routines that resulted. It's also been a time of reflection and making a few decisions about the future. If you're wondering why I've edited my beard back to something a bit more planet Earth than Middle Earth, well, it's part of that psychological shift in focus. This year, I've decided to build on some of the ideas I've mentioned in the past, but haven't delved into too deeply yet, and I'd love to have your input. I'll be talking a lot more about the Autistic Triad in particular, and about our autistic spiky skill sets, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say and what you'd like me to cover. If you were to map out the highs and lows of those skills, what would you include? What categories should we divide those essential skills into? How would we measure them against the average? We're at an exciting point in autistic history where we're starting to define and understand ourselves much better than the medical establishment that separated us in the first place, and every story we share builds that foundation of communal self-discovery ever stronger. Remember that if you want to tell me your story but you don't want to post it in a public comment, you can email me at comms@autismatic.com to share it in private. Every email is read and adds to my understanding of who we are and how we fit into the world, but as much as I'd love to be able to, I can't reply to everyone. I had to put the plans and discussions about an Autismatic-centred community on hold for a bit whilst family affairs took the priority, but I'll be picking up on that again soon, so thanks to everyone who got in touch so far and for your input and ideas. It's very likely going to be linked to my Patreon, but if you don't want to or can't afford to contribute to the cost of running the channel, you can still sign up as a free member and be among the first to know about it. See you soon. If you've already liked and subscribed and would like to support the channel more, then please follow the Patreon links in the description to pledge what you feel is fair and affordable to help keep the lights on here and the content keep flowing.